We're looking here at a huge sculpture just outside of the French city of Dijon by Klaus Sluter, the famous Moses well, one of the works of art not in DC that we'll focus on through the worksheets. The figures that you see here are all well over life size, larger than 6 feet tall, the figures alone. And as you can see in the photo on the left, they've been placed well overhead as well. Their feet are above eye level, and they look out past us. I think each one of them is a prophet, and I think that this is a symbol of them being prophets, is the fact that they look sort of over our shoulders, seeing things that we cannot. Around 1400, the city of Dijon was the capital of the Duchy of Burgundy. This was a subsection of the Kingdom of France, which was ruled with increasing independence by the Duke of Burgundy, Duke Philip the Bold, the younger brother of the French king, and we've spoken about him in class. In 1369, Philip had extended his territories by marrying the daughter of the Count of Flanders, bringing the county of Flanders, a good chunk of which is modern Belgium, parts of Holland, bringing that territory under his rule as well. So as the Duke of Burgundy, he had a divided realm, the area that is still called Burgundy today and the other area that we call Belgium today. The artist of the Well of Moses, Klaus Sluter, came from this area. He was part of the region of the County of Flanders. So did the painter who originally colored the Well of Moses. You can see some of the original paint on certain sections of the figures. We'll talk more about this. And a number of other artists who were also working for Philip the Bold also came from this region of Flanders. It seems to have been a hotbed of artistic activity. The Well of Moses is still in the exact site it was originally placed, in the center of a monastery that Philip the Bold had founded. We see here inside of its protective structure when you go visit it in Dijon. Here is the monastery that Philip the Bold has founded, the monastery of Champmol, just outside of the city of Dijon. It's called a chartreuse, the chartreuse of Champmol, because a chartreuse is a Carthusian monastery. This belonged to a particular order of monks called the Carthusians, who we'll talk a bit more about. Philip's portrait can be found here with his wife on the right, the Countess of Flanders, and their patron saints, and they are praying to the Virgin Mary as you enter the chapel at the monastery. This sculpture is also by Klaus Sluter. Here's a close-up of Philip. He paid to have the monastery founded for a number of different reasons. First of these is the idea of good works, a work of charity that would help atone for his sins. We've talked about this in class as well. Commissioning a work of fine art was seen as a good work for the church, something to benefit the church, and would then be something that could help atone for Philip the Bold's own sinful activity. Having a group of Carthusian monks praying for him didn't help either, or didn't hurt, I should say, either. Added to his surety of salvation. The second thing is that he had hoped to retire here after being duke, step down, and actually take up the vows of becoming a Carthusian monk himself. So the Chartreuse of Champmol, the monastery, was to be his eventual home. It would also be his eternal home, because he wanted the monastery to be a burial site. And that's the third reason he paid for the work, to be a burial site not only for himself, but for his wife, and for their heirs, all the future dukes of Burgundy. He wanted them to be buried here as well. And thus he donated a number of works to the site, including the Moses well, the sculptures on the front of the chapel, various paintings. One of the works we know that came from here is something we discussed in class, this little polyptych, these two panels in the Walters from this polyptych that Philip used during his lifetime and then donated to the monastery at Champmol, where later again it was separated and parts of it sold to different collections. The Well of Moses is situated in the middle of a cloister. The cloister is a common part of a medieval monastery. It's a covered walkway that connects the monks' houses with the other major buildings in the monastery. The monks' houses then ringed the outside of this. You can see on the left-hand side that each of them had their own little garden. And the walkway, which faced the cloister in the middle, would have connected then their houses with the chapel, which you see in the lower right corner, with other prominent buildings such as the refectory where they ate, or the chapter house where they heard the rules of the order read to them every single day. Like most monasteries, the cloister also enclosed a green space. It had herbs growing here for medicine, but also herbs for cooking, culinary and medicinal herbs grown in the garden. This particular cloister had a natural spring in the center of the cloister garden, and the Well of Moses was placed directly on top of that spring. Here we're looking down into it. This was taken during the summer, so the water level's quite low, but you can see the algae and the moss growing on the grate down below. It still supplies water. This is why we call it the Well of Moses. It marked a well. There was, in fact, water from the bottom of it. What we see as we look at the Well of Moses is indeed just the base of something much larger. Originally, there was a crucifixion scene on top of this. So you can see that the Well of Moses spreads out with a cornice, and that cornice supported additional life-size figures. At least the image of Mary Magdalene, but maybe more images mourning the death of Christ on a crucifix all the way at the top. So you can see it was really quite a massive work. The building that it's sitting in now is not the original building for it. It would not have fit in here. This adds to our understanding of the Well of Moses, because the figures that we see down below, these prophets on the base, are in fact foretelling the coming of the Christian Messiah, the Judeo-Christian Messiah. They are actually indicating that Christ will indeed come, and if our eyes then follow upward, we see that Christ is in fact come. So they are just an introduction to the main scene, which is Jesus on the cross. And so there are prophets on either side, each of them holding a scroll that foretells the coming of Christ, the coming of the Messiah. And the fact that there was originally a crucifixion at the top explains the angels on the corners underneath the cornice. They are mourning the death of Christ, which would have been seen above them, just as we've seen in other Christian images such as Giotto's frescoes. They are there to mourn the passing of Christ in heaven, mourning them in heaven, just as we mourn on earth. The main figure is Moses, and this gets us to sort of the theme of the work, which is to talk about its extraordinary detail. The face of Moses is sculpted with every single wrinkle. It's easy to tell his wizened age, the dried skin, the beard, and his hair carved sort of strand by strand. This attention to detail is a hallmark of artists that came from the county of Flanders, and we'll only see it increase as we move into the 15th century, move further on past Klaus Sluter. Notice the leather belt that is strapped around his waist and the number of tongue holes there are in the belt, and how each of the tongue holes has been supported by a secondary piece of leather, as belts tend to pull apart. Again, that's that attention to detail that we see with Sluter's work, but we also see elsewhere. He carries tablets in his right hand, the tablets that he received on Mount Sinai from the burning bush, the Ten Commandments. Certainly this helps us to identify him. The words that were originally on his scroll help to identify him. Of course, it says Moses, prophet, beneath his feet as well. But there's another way in which we can identify this as Moses, and that is the fact that he has horns. You'll notice the sort of Hellboy nubs on his forehead here. This requires a little bit of explanation. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai carrying the Ten Commandments, which is sort of what we see here, the Bible says that his face shined with the glory of God. He was beaming with God's glory, having seen God. And early on, there was a mistranslation of this that said that Moses had horns. They mistranslated the verb shines with the glory of God into has horns. And that might sound crazy, but, he has been talking to a bush, right? So the idea of having horns is not extraordinary in this particular narrative. Well, by the 4th century, St. Jerome, who was compiling the official Latin version of the Bible and was going back through all of the other translations of the Bible, saw this and corrected it. He was a wordsmith, a scholar, knew the right translation and fixed it. So already by the 4th century, people knew that Moses did not have horns, but Moses' face glowed with the glory of God. That said, it became a shorthand for helping to identify Moses, was to show those horns coming off of his head. So here's a 12th century English manuscript with Moses and Aaron up above teaching the children of Israel, and down below talking about why we eat kosher. You don't eat pigs in muck. And you'll see that in each of them, the artist has sort of translated the idea of the horns and the idea of shining, his face shining, into these horns that appear to be almost like rays of light coming off of his head. Even a century after Klaus Sluter, Michelangelo, no less a sculptor than Michelangelo, gives Moses horns. And again, it's not that neither of them knew better, they did. But this had become a shorthand for helping to identify Moses. So this is why he has those nubs on his head. We'll look at the other 6 prophets, although not in the same amount of detail as Moses. Immediately to Moses' left, on your right, is King David. We can identify him right away by his crown. David, the king from the Old Testament. Of course, he's one of many kings, but we begin to identify him through what he wears. You'll notice that his crown is decorated with the fleur-de-lis. We use it at Marymount as our symbol, but it was also the French royal emblem at this point for the last 400, 500 years. It's important to remember that Philip the Bold, the man who paid for this, was the brother of the King of France. He's part of the French royal family. And having David wear the fleur-de-lis in his crown indicates the royal patronage, right? That the money for this came from royalty. It was also common in the Middle Ages for the kings of France to trace their lineage all the way back to Old Testament kings as a sort of propaganda for supporting their rule. And Klaus Sluter, right, Philip the Bold are picking up on exactly this idea that the modern kings of France have a linkage back to the kings of the Old Testament. Well, this is certainly some Old Testament king. We know that he's King David by a couple of small details. You'll notice that the edge of his robe has 2 different designs carved into it. One of them is a series of lowercase d's, which you see on the left of this detail. And the other is a series of harps. King David composed the book of Psalms, which are songs in praise of God. And of course, then he has harps decorating his robe to show that this is not just any Old Testament king, but that, again, this is David. And of course, if none of that made sense, you could see down beneath his feet, it tells us exactly who he is, and the words on his scroll would also further identify him. Moving our way around the well, next to David's left on your right, is the prophet Jeremiah. And I love him because he's just got such an amazing face. And again, that sense of portraiture almost that each of these figures has been totally individualized. I also love the detail in the book as he's flipping through the pages and holding that very, very heavy book. Remember that this is carved out of stone, and Klaus Sluter has made a point of carving in between the pages as they flip out through the book. And he's even using the leather cover of the book to hold a spot in the book as Jeremiah is about to flip and do his cross-referencing with his hand now inside the folds of the book. How Sluter did that is absolutely beyond me. How do you get the tool down inside of there to carve that sort of thing? The realism of this work would have been picked up by other details. For example, you'll notice how he squints as he's reading. He's sort of rearing his head back and looking down. We have, in fact, payments to a goldsmith for making wireframe glasses that would have sat on his nose and attached to small little holes that you can't see in the shadows above his ears. So he would have been looking through real glasses. And again, remember that this was entirely painted. So his flesh was originally flesh-colored as well. It was extraordinarily realistic, squinting through a pair of reading glasses in order to read the text that he holds sort of almost at arm's length. It's also been suggested, and it looks pretty good to me, that this figure of Jeremiah is a portrait of Philip the Bold, who we saw on the front of the chapel. And indeed, very similar face, very similar eyes, very similar chin line. It certainly does look like him. And this was pretty common. We've seen it elsewhere in class, where if you pay for a work of art, one of the things that you can request is to be included within that work of art, either as an onlooker or even as one of the characters in the scene itself. And that seems to be the case here, that Philip the Bold is included here as the prophet Jeremiah. Next to Jeremiah is Zechariah, and you'll notice that whereas the other ones look out sort of past us, Zechariah actually looks directly down to us, almost as if he's imploring us to think about the death of Christ that we would have originally seen up above. Right. Our very last two figures on the Moses well are Daniel on the left and Isaiah on the right. And they're really, in many ways, the most vibrant figures here, although each of them has their own individuality. I particularly react to these ones, engage with them, because of the way that they engage with each other. You'll notice that both Isaiah on the right and Daniel on the left lean out as if they just recognize that there's somebody else here around the corner from me, and they're trying to sort of talk to each other in our space, right? They're almost like they're trying to escape from this hexagonal base and have a little chat with each other. That enhances the realism of the work. It's almost truly as if they're alive. Even Isaiah lifts up the weight off of one foot as he's sort of leaning around as if he's about to step over and sort of join Daniel on his side of the sculpture. All of this realism would have been enhanced by painting. Remember that every element of this would have been originally painted. It looks like stone to us now, but it would have looked like flesh and blood and fabric and hair to anybody that would have seen it at the time, because every part would have been painted in a range of different colors. Here's a close-up of the face of Isaiah, where, in fact, we can see how very much he has been individualized. Like we saw in Moses, wrinkles, hair carved, strand by strand, his nose sort of wrinkling up, even the pupils of his eyes painted in as he looks around to see his friend Daniel on the other side of the well. Finally, our last detail here, the side of his head, where we can see he's got a bit of hair on the back. But more important, I wanted to look at those blood vessels that seem to be pulsing on his temples. What an amazing sort of observation and detail to include in the work. That's make it that much more truly alive. Now, all of this realism was intended to add to the effect that it would have on any viewer of the work, especially the faithful viewer, the faithful Christian who comes. This realism would have made Christianity vibrant and real to them, and enhanced the effect of any sort of prayer you might have said while you were here. And it seems to have worked. 10 years after the Well of Moses was completed, in 1416, viewers who came to the monastery of Champmol, if they prayed to this in the right mindset, in the right attitude of heart, they could receive a pardon for all of their sins simply for praying in front of the Moses well. Its realism, its effect on the viewer was just that strong. Well, the kind of realism we're seeing here in sculpture, we're going to see get even more detailed as we move into the 15th century, particularly in painting. Because most of the artists that we're going to look at next are artists that, like Klaus Sluter, came from the county of Flanders, where this kind of realism seems to have been the order of the day. And this hyper-realism that we see coming from Flanders, that we see starting with Klaus Sluter, will be discussed further in class and on the next worksheet.